On a humid summer evening in Charleston, Sarah Washington pulled up to the historic Grand Hotel in her sleek black Mercedes. The journey from Atlanta had been long, and all she wanted was to check in and rest before tomorrow's important client meeting. At 35, Sarah had worked incredibly hard to become one of Atlanta's top corporate attorneys, and these business trips were now a regular part of her life. The hotel's grand facade stretched into the darkening sky, its colonial architecture illuminated by warm golden lights. The lobby was exactly what you'd expect from a luxury hotel: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and elaborate flower arrangements that filled the air with a subtle fragrance. Several guests milled about, some dressed in evening wear heading to the hotel's famous restaurant, while others lounged in the plush seating areas. Sarah approached the front desk with the confidence that came from years of professional success. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, drawing the attention of James Mitchell, the hotel administrator who was organizing some papers behind the counter. He looked up briefly, then returned to his task without acknowledgement. "Good evening," Sarah said pleasantly, placing her designer bag on the floor beside her. "I have a reservation under Sarah Washington." James Mitchell, a man in his mid-50s with graying temples and wire-rimmed glasses, slowly looked up from his papers. His eyes moved from Sarah's face to her expensive suit, then back to his computer screen. The slight tightening around his mouth didn't go unnoticed by Sarah, who had spent years reading people's expressions in courtrooms. "One moment, please," he said, his fingers tapping on the keyboard with deliberate slowness. The clicking of keys stretched on for an uncomfortably long time. Sarah checked her phone. 8:45 p.m. She had confirmed her reservation just that morning, wanting to make sure everything would be perfect for her stay. The booking confirmation email was still there in her inbox. "I'm afraid I'm having some trouble with our system," Mitchell finally said, his voice carrying a tone that Sarah had heard too many times before. "It seems to be experiencing technical difficulties." A young couple walked up to the desk next to her. Mitchell immediately smiled at them. "How can I help you this evening?" "We'd like a room for tonight," the woman said, holding her husband's hand. Without checking the supposedly malfunctioning system, Mitchell responded cheerfully, "Of course, we have several lovely rooms available." Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but years of professional experience had taught her to maintain her composure. She pulled out her phone and quietly began recording, keeping the device partially hidden by her purse. "Excuse me," she interrupted politely, "but I couldn't help noticing that the system seems to be working fine for their reservation. Perhaps you could check mine again?" Mitchell's face flushed slightly. "Ma'am, as I explained, your particular reservation is causing some issues in our system. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the Holiday Inn down the street. They might have availability." The suggestion to try a lower-tier hotel wasn't subtle. Several nearby guests had stopped their conversations, the uncomfortable situation drawing their attention. Sarah noticed an elderly woman shaking her head in disapproval, though whether at her or at Mitchell's behavior, she couldn't tell. Taking a deep breath, Sarah reached into her briefcase and pulled out her Bar Association card along with her business card from Johnson, Williams & Partners, one of Atlanta's most prestigious law firms. She placed them carefully on the counter. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I made this reservation 2 weeks ago and confirmed it this morning. I have the confirmation email. Are you suggesting that there's some other reason you're unable to honor my reservation?" Mitchell's eyes widened slightly as he read her credentials. His hands fumbled with the keyboard, but Sarah had already made her decision. She'd faced discrimination before, but she'd learned to fight it differently now, not with immediate confrontation, but with calculated strategy. "You know what? Please cancel my reservation if you haven't already," she said calmly, picking up her cards and placing them back in her wallet. "And Mr. Mitchell, please make sure to save tonight's security footage. You'll be hearing from my office soon." With that, Sarah picked up her bag and walked toward the exit, her head held high. As she waited for the valet to bring her car, she was already composing an email to her partners about what had just transpired. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about making sure this didn't happen to anyone else. Little did James Mitchell know, but his discriminatory actions that evening would soon lead to consequences he never expected. James Mitchell's hands trembled slightly as he watched Sarah Washington's Mercedes pull away from the hotel. Something about her calm demeanor and those business cards made him uneasy. He tried to push the feeling aside, telling himself he had done nothing wrong, just following what he considered the hotel's unofficial practices. The next morning, Mitchell arrived at work early, hoping to put the previous night's incident behind him. As he walked through the employee entrance, Maria Rodriguez, one of the housekeepers who had worked at the hotel for 20 years, gave him an unusually cold look. She had witnessed the entire scene from the lobby where she had been arranging fresh flowers. "Mr. Mitchell," she called out, her voice firm. "What you did last night. My daughter experiences the same thing. She's a doctor, but people still treat her differently because of her skin color. I thought this hotel was better than that." Mitchell hurried past her, muttering about being late for a meeting. In his office, he found several messages waiting from the hotel owner, Richard Henderson, all marked urgent. His stomach dropped as he picked up the phone to return the calls. Meanwhile, across town at the Charleston Marriott, Sarah sat in her hotel room, already dressed for court. Her laptop was open, displaying dozens of emails from her law firm partners. After she had sent her initial email last night describing the incident, her inbox had exploded with responses. "The security footage has been requested. Read one email from her colleague Michael Chen, and you won't believe what we found. There are 3 similar complaints filed against the historic Grand in the past year alone." Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Lisa Johnson, the firm's senior partner. "This is bigger than one incident. Want to take this on as a full case. Clear your schedule for tomorrow's partner meeting." Back at the historic Grand, Mitchell's day was getting worse by the hour. The hotel owner had called him into an emergency meeting after receiving multiple calls from journalists asking for comments about allegations of discriminatory practices. "What were you thinking?" Henderson demanded, throwing a printout of Sarah's law firm's website on the desk. "Do you know who she is? She's won every major discrimination case she's handled in the past 5 years. Mitchell's face grew pale as he scrolled through Sarah Washington's impressive legal record on his phone. Cases against major corporations, healthcare facilities, and yes, hotels. Each victory had led to significant changes in company policies and substantial settlements. The hotel's PR team was already in crisis mode. Social media was buzzing with guests who had witnessed the previous night's incident sharing their stories. A video clip, recorded by one of the lobby guests, was starting to circulate online. By afternoon, Mitchell found himself sitting in a mandatory meeting with the hotel's legal team. They reviewed the security footage from the previous night, and Mitchell watched himself in horror. His dismissive behavior, the sudden ability to help other guests, the thinly veiled suggestions about other hotels. Seen through an outsider's eyes, his actions were glaringly discriminatory. "We've pulled the records," the hotel's attorney said grimly. "In the past hour when you claimed the system was down, you checked in 7 other guests, all of them white. Care to explain that?" Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his carefully constructed justifications crumbling. The weight of his actions, not just from last night, but from years of subtle discrimination, began to settle on his shoulders. As the day drew to a close, Mitchell received another shock. A formal letter arrived from Johnson, Williams and Partners, announcing their intention to investigate the hotel's booking practices over the past 5 years. They were specifically requesting all records of denied check-ins, system malfunctions, and guest complaints. In the employee break room, Mitchell overheard 2 young receptionists discussing the situation. "Did you see her legal record?" One whispered. "She's represented the NAACP and won a huge case against the Riverside hotel chain last year. They had to pay millions in damages and completely revamped their hiring practices." Mitchell's phone buzzed again, another message from the hotel owner. "Meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. sharp. Bring all guest complaint records from the past year." And Mitchell? "Start looking for a good lawyer. You're going to need one." As he drove home that evening, Mitchell passed a billboard advertising the historic Grand Hotel. The slogan read, "Where every guest is treated like royalty." The irony wasn't lost on him. In just 24 hours, his comfortable world had begun to unravel, and he had a sinking feeling that Sarah Washington's exit from the hotel lobby the night before was just the beginning of a much bigger story. Sarah Washington sat at the head of the conference table in her firm's Atlanta office, surrounded by a team of determined attorneys. 3 weeks had passed since the incident at the historic Grand Hotel, and what had started as Michael Chen reported, sliding a thick folder across the table. 47 people have come forward with similar experiences at the historic Grand over the past 3 years. The pattern is impossible to ignore. Lisa Johnson, the senior partner, nodded as she reviewed the testimonials. Sarah, your incident was just the tip of the iceberg. We have doctors, business executives, even a state senator, all reporting similar technical difficulties with their reservations. The evidence they had gathered was damning. Maria Rodriguez, the hotel housekeeper, had become a key witness, providing detailed accounts of the hotel's unwritten policies. She had documented dates, times, and specific incidents she had witnessed over her 20 years of employment. Meanwhile, in Charleston, James Mitchell's life had become a nightmare. The hotel had placed him on paid administrative leave pending investigation, but the damage to his reputation was already severe. Local newspapers had picked up the story, and his name was becoming synonymous with the growing scandal. His wife had found out about the incident from their neighbors, whose daughter followed Sarah Washington on social media. "How could you?" she had asked, the disappointment in her voice cutting deeper than anger. "My best friend is black. Our children's godparents are black. What were you thinking?" The hotel's owner, Richard Henderson, was facing his own crisis. The historic Grand's bookings have dropped by 40% since the story broke. Corporate clients were canceling their contracts, and the hotel's once sterling reputation was in tatters. Back in Atlanta, Sarah worked late into the night, reviewing security footage the hotel had been forced to surrender. The tapes showed a clear pattern. Mitchell wasn't the only staff member involved in these practices. There was an informal system in place, with code words and subtle signals used to flag certain guests. "Watch this," Sarah told her colleagues, pointing to a screen. "See how the desk staff touches their left ear when a black guest approaches? That's their signal to suddenly have computer problems or no available rooms." The legal team had also discovered something else: internal emails discussing ways to maintain the hotel's traditional atmosphere and preserve our established clientele. The coded language was thin cover for discriminatory policies. Maria Rodriguez had paid a price for her cooperation. Though protected legally as a whistleblower, she faced cold shoulders and whispered comments from some coworkers. But she stood firm, encouraged by her daughter's pride in her actions. "Mama," her daughter had said, "you're helping change things. This is how progress happens, one brave person at a time." Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was from James Mitchell's teenage son. "Ms. Washington, I saw what my dad did to you. I'm sorry." He's sorry too, but he's too proud to say it. "This whole thing has made our family talk about stuff we never discussed before." The message gave Sarah pause. This case wasn't just about punishment. It was about changing mindsets and breaking cycles of discrimination that had persisted for generations. In the conference room, Lisa Johnson outlined their strategy. "We're not just filing a discrimination lawsuit," she explained. "We're pushing for systematic change. New hiring practices, mandatory training, independent oversight of booking practices, and a fund for community education programs." Sarah nodded, remembering her own experiences with discrimination throughout her career. "This isn't about revenge," she said. "It's about making sure no one else has to experience what we documented here." The team worked late into the evening, preparing documents for what would become one of the most significant civil rights cases in Charleston's recent history. They knew the hotel's lawyers would fight back hard, but the evidence was overwhelming. As Sarah packed up her briefcase that night, she found another message, this time from Maria Rodriguez. "Tonight, I told my granddaughter that she can be anything she wants to be, and stay anywhere she wants to stay. Thank you for helping make that true." Looking out over the Atlanta skyline, Sarah thought about how one night of discrimination had sparked a movement for change. The historic Grand Hotel would never be the same, and neither would the people involved in this unfolding story. The next day, she would return to Charleston, not as a guest seeking a hotel room, but as an agent of change, armed with evidence, witnesses, and an unwavering determination to transform a moment of injustice into a catalyst for progress. The courthouse in Charleston buzzed with activity as Sarah Washington and her legal team prepared for the first major hearing in the historic Grand Hotel case. 4 months had passed since. Local news crews gathered outside, their cameras ready to capture what had become one of the most talked about civil rights cases in South Carolina. Inside the courtroom, Maria Rodriguez sat nervously in the witness stand, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Ms. Rodriguez," Sarah asked gently, "Can you tell the court what you witnessed during your 20 years working at the historic Grand Hotel?" Maria took a deep breath and began to speak. Her testimony was powerful: years of witness discrimination, coded language among staff, and specific incidents she had documented. The courtroom fell silent as she described how she had kept a secret diary of these events, hoping that someday someone would be brave enough to challenge the system. James Mitchell sat at the defense table, looking significantly older than he had 4 months ago. The stress had taken its toll. His hair had more gray, and deep lines had formed around his eyes. His wife sat in the back of the courtroom, her expression unreadable. As Maria continued her testimony, she pointed directly at Mitchell. "Mr. Mitchell wasn't the worst," she said clearly. "He was just the one who finally got caught. This system was in place long before he became administrator." The hotel's lawyers tried to discredit Maria's testimony, suggesting she had personal grievances against the hotel. But then Sarah presented the security footage. Dozens of incidents showing the same pattern of discrimination, the same coded signals, the same sudden computer problems when certain guests attempted to check in. During a break in the proceedings, Sarah received an unexpected visitor in the courthouse hallway. It was Henderson, the hotel owner, accompanied by his lawyers. "Ms. Washington," he said, his voice low, "we'd like to discuss a settlement." But Sarah was prepared for this. "Mr. Henderson, this isn't just about money anymore. We need guaranteed changes, systematic, verifiable changes." Back in the courtroom, the evidence continued to mount. Former guests testified about their experiences, each story adding to the pattern. A retired hotel employee revealed the existence of an unofficial preferred guest list that excluded minorities. The hotel's booking records showed a clear pattern of room unavailability that correlated directly with guests' racial backgrounds. Mitchell watched as his former world crumbled. The practices he had considered traditional were exposed for what they really were: discrimination, plain and simple. His son sat in the courtroom one day, watching the proceedings with a mixture of shame and understanding, learning hard lessons about right and wrong. During cross-examination, Mitchell finally broke down. "Yes, we had a system," he admitted. "Yes, we discriminated. We called it maintaining standards, but we knew what we were doing. I knew what I was doing that night with Ms. Washington." The admission sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Henderson, watching from the gallery, put his head in his hands. This confession would change everything. Sarah's phone kept buzzing with messages from other lawyers across the country, reporting similar cases at other hotels. What had started as one incident in Charleston was exposing a nationwide problem in the hospitality industry. Maria's daughter, watching from the public gallery, reached over and squeezed her mother's hand. "You did it, Mama," she whispered. "You helped break the silence." By the end of that day's session, Henderson's lawyers approached Sarah's team again. This time, they weren't just offering money. They were ready to discuss real changes: new hiring practices, mandatory training programs, external audits of booking practices, and a commitment to community outreach. Sarah looked at her clients: Maria, the other hotel employees who had come forward, and the dozens of guests who had shared their stories. This case had become about more than one night's discrimination. It was about changing an entire system. As she packed up her briefcase that evening, Sarah found a note on her desk. It was from Mitchell's wife. "Thank you for forcing us to confront this. My husband needed to learn this lesson. We all did." Outside the courthouse, reporters asked Sarah for comments about the day's developments. She looked directly into the cameras and said, "This case isn't just about one hotel or one incident. It's about acknowledging a problem that exists throughout our society and taking concrete steps to fix it." The sun was setting over Charleston as Sarah walked to her car. Tomorrow would bring more testimonies, more evidence, and hopefully more steps toward real change. That historic Grand Hotel would never be the same, and that was exactly the point. The conference room at Johnson, Williams and Partners was filled with tension as Sarah Washington faced the historic Grand Hotel's representatives. Richard Henderson, a hotel owner, sat across from Sarah, flanked by his lawyers. The man looked exhausted, his once proud posture now slouched with the weight of public scrutiny and financial losses. The hotel's occupancy rate had dropped to 30%, and corporate clients were still canceling their contracts. "Before we begin," Sarah said, opening her laptop. "I'd like to show you something." She played a video compilation of interviews with former guests who had experienced discrimination at the hotel. The stories were powerful. A black surgeon turned away during a medical conference. An Asian family told their confirmed reservation was lost. A Latino executive redirected to a budget hotel despite his platinum membership status. Henderson watched the screen, his face growing paler with each testimony. When the video ended, he cleared his throat. "Ms. Washington, what exactly do you want?" Sarah smiled. It was the question she'd been waiting for. "Real change, Mr. Henderson, not just at your hotel, but industry-wide reform." She laid out her demands: complete overhaul of hiring practices, mandatory quarterly diversity training, independent auditors to monitor booking patterns, a scholarship fund for minority students in hospitality management, and a public acknowledgement of past discriminatory practices. Meanwhile, across town, James Mitchell sat in his home office, staring at the resignation letter he had finally decided to write. His son knocked on the door, entering with 2 cups of coffee. "Dad," he said, placing 1 cup on the desk, "I've been thinking about applying to law school. This whole case, it made me realize how important it is to fight for what's right." Mitchell looked at his son, seeing him in a new light. Maybe something good could come from all this after all. Back at the settlement meeting, the negotiations continued. Henderson's lawyers argued over details, but Sarah remained firm. She had Maria Rodriguez on standby, ready to testify about more incidents if needed. "Your hotel has 2 choices," Sarah explained calmly. "Fight us in court, where all these stories will become public record, or work with us to become an example of positive change in the industry." During a break, Sarah received an unexpected call from the National Hotel Association. Other hotels had been watching the case closely, and there was growing interest in developing industry-wide anti-discrimination standards. "Your case has opened a lot of eyes," the association representative said. "We'd like to create a task force to address these issues, and we want you to be part of it." Henderson returned from consulting with his board of directors. The decision had been made. They would accept Sarah's terms. As the lawyers began drafting the agreement, Henderson asked for a private word with Sarah. "I inherited this hotel from my father," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "He inherited it from his father. We've been operating the same way for so long, we stopped seeing what we were really doing. I'm sorry it took this to make us change." Maria Rodriguez, who had been waiting outside, was invited in to hear the settlement terms. Tears filled her eyes as Sarah outlined the changes that would be implemented, including a promotion for Maria to Director of Guest Relations, a new position created to ensure all guests received equal treatment. Later that evening, Sarah called a meeting with all the plaintiffs who had joined the case. They gathered in a local community center where she presented the settlement terms. The room erupted in applause when she announced that beyond monetary compensation, the hotel would be required to display a permanent exhibit in its lobby documenting this case and its commitment to equal rights. "This isn't just a victory for us," Sarah told the group. "This is a victory for everyone who's ever been made to feel unwelcome because of who they are." As she drove home that night, Sarah passed the historic Grand Hotel. The building looked the same, but everything about it was about to change. Workers were already removing the old sign, preparing to install a new one that would include the tagline, "Where everyone is truly welcome." Her phone buzzed with a message from Lisa Johnson. "The New York Times wants to do a feature story on the case. This is going to change hotels across the country." Sarah smiled, thinking about how one night of discrimination had led to this moment of transformation. The next phase would be even more challenging, ensuring that the promised changes actually happened. But for now, she allowed herself to feel the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes standing up for what's right could change not just one hotel, but an entire industry's way of thinking. 1 year had passed since the historic Grand Hotel case settlement, and Sarah Washington stood in the hotel's newly renovated lobby, watching the installation of the promised civil rights exhibit. The glass cases contained photographs, documents, and testimonies chronicling both the hotel's discriminatory past and its journey toward change. Today was particularly significant. The hotel was hosting its first Diversity in Hospitality conference, and Sarah was the keynote speaker. As she prepared her notes, she noticed James Mitchell entering the lobby, looking markedly different from the man she first encountered a year ago. Mitchell had spent the past year working with civil rights organizations, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about how prejudice can become normalized in institutional settings. He'd asked to speak at today's conference, wanting to contribute to the change he'd once resisted. Ms. Washington, he said, approaching her cautiously, I never properly apologized to you in person. I was hoping we could talk before the conference begins. Sarah nodded, and they found a quiet corner near the new exhibit. Mitchell's eyes lingered on a photo of himself from the previous year, displayed alongside quotes from his court testimony about the hotel's discriminatory practices. My son started law school last month, Mitchell said, his voice thick with emotion. He's focusing on civil rights law. He says you inspired him to fight for change instead of protecting broken systems like I did. The conference room filled quickly with hotel managers, industry leaders, and civil rights advocates from across the country. Richard Henderson, still the hotel owner but now committed to its transformation, opened the session. A year ago, this hotel was a symbol of discrimination, he began. Today, we're proud to be leading the conversation about change in the hospitality industry. Sarah watched as Maria Rodriguez guided her team of staff members, all wearing new uniforms with the hotel's new logo, a design created by a local black artist, featuring intertwined hands of different colors. The hotel's booking statistics were displayed on a screen, a perfect balance of guests from all backgrounds, consistently high satisfaction ratings, and a waiting list for corporate clients who wanted to be associated with the hotel's new image. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she shared not just the legal victory, but the human impact of the case. She talked about the letters she received from people across the country, sharing their own experiences of discrimination and their hope for change. This case was never about punishing one hotel or one person, she explained. It was about transforming an industry that had normalized discrimination under the guise of tradition. During the lunch break, Mitchell's son approached Sarah. He was wearing a law school t-shirt and carrying a copy of the case documents. We're studying your case in my civil rights class, he said proudly. Professor says it's already being cited in other discrimination lawsuits across different industries. The afternoon sessions included workshops led by Maria Rodriguez, who had become a sought-after speaker on implementing institutional change. Her daughter, now a resident physician, sat in the audience, beaming with pride. My mother taught me to stand up for what's right, Maria told the attendees. Now I'm teaching others how to create environments where standing up isn't necessary because discrimination isn't tolerated in the first place. As the conference drew to a close, Henderson unveiled the hotel's new training program, which would be shared freely with other hotels wanting to follow their example. The program, developed in consultation with civil rights experts, included virtual reality scenarios that helped staff recognize and address their own biases. Sarah's law firm had received requests from hotels across the country, asking for help in reviewing and revising their policies. The historic Grand Hotel case had created a ripple effect throughout the industry. At the end of the day, Sarah stood alone in front of the civil rights exhibit. Her reflection in the glass overlapped with the photographs and documents that told the story of transformation. A young black girl approached, looking at the display with curiosity. My mom says you made them change, the girl said. She says we can stay in any hotel we want now. Sarah smiled, remembering her own childhood experiences with discrimination. That's right, she replied. And one day, people will find it hard to believe things were ever different. As she left the hotel that evening, Sarah noticed the sunset reflecting off the new sign. Historic Grand Hotel, where history meets progress. The words now meant something very different from what they had meant just 1 year ago. 2 years after the landmark case, the historic Grand Hotel had become a model for institutional change across the hospitality industry. Sarah Washington stood at her office window in Atlanta, reviewing the latest national statistics on hotel discrimination cases. They had dropped by 60% since her case made headlines. Her phone buzzed with a message from Maria Rodriguez. You need to see this. Attached was a link to a major news story. James Mitchell had just. We're expanding, Catherine announced, spreading architectural plans across Sarah's desk. We're opening 5 new hotels, all built on the principles we learned from your case. But we need your help to make sure we get it right from the start. The plans showed modern hotels designed with inclusion in mind, from the art on the walls to the staff training facilities. Each location would feature a civil rights education center open to the public, building on the success of the original exhibit at the Charleston Hotel. Meanwhile, Maria Rodriguez had been promoted to Regional Director of Guest Relations, overseeing the quality initiatives at multiple hotels. Her training program had become mandatory for hotel staff across South Carolina, with other states following suit. Sarah's phone rang again. This time it was Mitchell's son, now in his final year of law school. "I'm doing my thesis on the historic Grand case," he said excitedly. "Did you know it's being taught in business schools now, not just law schools? They're using it as a case study in corporate transformation." Later that day, Sarah visited the Charleston Hotel for a special ceremony. The hotel was receiving an award from the Civil Rights Commission for its dramatic turnaround and ongoing commitment to equality. The lobby was packed with familiar faces, people who had been part of the original case, now gathering to celebrate its lasting impact. James Mitchell was there, standing quietly at the back of the room. His hair was completely gray now, but his eyes were clearer, unburdened by the weight of prejudice he carried for so long. His wife stood beside him, wearing a pin that read "Alley for Change." Maria Rodriguez took the podium, her voice strong and confident. "2 years ago, this hotel was a symbol of discrimination," she said. "Today, it's a beacon of hope. Our occupancy rates are higher than ever, our staff is the most diverse in the state, and most importantly, every guest who walks through these doors knows they're truly welcome." The ceremony included a surprise announcement. The hotel was establishing a scholarship fund in Sarah's name for minority students pursuing careers in hospitality management or civil rights law. The first recipient would be a young woman who had been turned away from the hotel 3 years ago. After the ceremony, Sarah walked through the hotel's halls with Catherine Henderson. The changes were everywhere, from the diverse staff members to the multilingual welcome signs, from the cultural sensitivity training schedules posted in staff areas to the proud display of the hotel's perfect equality audit scores. "You know what the best part is?" Catherine said, stopping by the civil rights exhibit. "Our revenues are up 40% from when we were discriminating. Turns out, doing the right thing is good for business too." As the day drew to a close, Sarah received one more surprise. A letter had arrived from a major hotel chain in Europe. They wanted her help in implementing similar changes across their properties. The ripples from the historic Grand case were spreading across oceans. Back in her hotel room, yes, she was staying at the historic Grand, Sarah reflected on how far they'd come. The room service attendant who brought her dinner was wearing a name tag that included his pronouns and could speak 3 languages. The hotel's magazine featured articles about diversity in travel, and the room's art celebrated local minority artists. Before going to bed, Sarah read one last email, a thank you note from a young black couple who had just held their wedding at the hotel. Attached was a photo of them standing proudly in the same lobby where she had once been turned away. "Because of you," they wrote, "our children will grow up in a world where they're welcome everywhere they go." Sarah smiled, knowing that while there was still work to be done, a historic Grand Hotel case had proven that real, lasting change was possible, one person, one policy, one principle at a time. 5 years had passed since the historic Grand Hotel case, and Sarah Washington stood in front of a packed auditorium at Harvard Business School. She was there to deliver a lecture about the lasting impact of what had become known as the Charleston Change. The case that began with one denied check-in had transformed into a movement that revolutionized the hospitality industry. Maria Rodriguez was now the executive vice president of diversity and inclusion for a major international hotel chain, traveling the world to implement the training programs she had helped develop. Her original diary documenting discrimination at the historic Grand had been donated to the Smithsonian, part of an exhibit on modern civil rights movements. James Mitchell, whose discriminatory actions had sparked it all, sat in the front row of the auditorium. He had become an unlikely but powerful advocate for change, his story of transformation inspiring others to confront their own biases. His son, now a practicing civil rights attorney, worked alongside Sarah at her firm. The most powerful lesson, Sarah told the students, wasn't just about ending discrimination. It was about how changing one institution could change an entire industry. The statistics backed her words. Hotel discrimination complaints had dropped by 80% nationwide. The historic Grand's model of inclusive hospitality had been adopted by hotels in 47 countries. The original Charleston Hotel had maintained its full occupancy rates for 3 straight years, proving that equality was good for business. During the lecture, Sarah shared a recent development. Richard Henderson had sold his entire hotel chain to his daughter Catherine, who had transformed it into the country's first hotel group with a perfect equality rating for 5 consecutive years. The original civil rights exhibit in the Charleston Hotel had expanded into a full museum wing, drawing visitors from around the world. School groups regularly toured the facility, learning how one moment of discrimination had sparked systemic change. After the lecture, Sarah met with a group of hotel management students. Among them was Mitchell's granddaughter, who was writing her thesis on how her grandfather's story had influenced corporate ethics training. "The most amazing thing," the young woman said, "is that my grandfather's biggest mistake led to his greatest contribution to society." Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Maria Rodriguez. The United Nations had just adopted the hospitality industry standards that Maria had helped develop, guidelines that would now be implemented globally. Later that evening, Sarah returned to the historic Grand Hotel in Charleston for a special anniversary event. The lobby where she had once been turned away was now hosting an international conference on equality in tourism. Catherine Henderson welcomed her with a warm embrace. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a wall of photographs. They showed hundreds of diverse guests who had shared their stories of feeling truly welcome at the hotel. James Mitchell, now retired but still active in advocacy work, approached Sarah with tears in his eyes. "5 years ago, I thought you were going to destroy this hotel," he said quietly. "Instead, you helped us rebuild it into something better than it had ever been." The hotel staff, led by Maria's daughter who had followed in her mother's footsteps, demonstrated their new check-in process, a model of efficiency and equality that had been adopted by hotels worldwide. As the evening drew to a close, Sarah was presented with a special honor. The hotel's new training center, which would provide free certification programs for minority students entering the hospitality industry, would bear her name. But the real victory, Sarah told the gathered crowd, isn't in the buildings we've renamed or the policies we've changed. It's in the mindsets we transformed. It's in knowing that when someone walks into this hotel, or any hotel that has followed our example, they'll be judged only by the content of their character. The final speaker of the evening was a young black girl, the same one who had spoken to Sarah at the Civil Rights exhibit years ago. Now a teenager, she was entering hotel management school on a scholarship created by the historic Grand. "Ms. Washington showed us that change is possible," the girl said confidently. "She taught us that standing up for what's right can transform not just one moment, but an entire future." As Sarah left the hotel that night, she paused to look at her reflection in the lobby windows. The historic Grand stood as a testament to the power of confronting discrimination with determination, dignity, and a vision for change. What had begun as one woman's stand against injustice had become a blueprint for transformation, proving that sometimes the most powerful changes start with a single moment of courage.